I work with Professor Wolff as part of Democracy at Work. We are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to amplify Professor Wolff's work through a variety of different kinds of media. Most of you are probably familiar with the weekly radio show, Economic Update, which is syndicated nationally on Pacifica and other public radio stations. We also produce video content. For example, we're shooting the lecture as we normally do this evening, and other kinds of videos, lectures, and so on. We book Professor Wolff on speaking engagements around the country, and we're working all the time to improve the offerings that we have and get the message out ever wider. To that end, please do visit our website, democracyatwork.info. We also have a newsletter that we send out about quarterly via email. I'm going to pass around this sheet. Feel free to sign it, along with put your email address on there, and we will sign you up for that newsletter. We don't use your email address for any other purpose. If you've already signed up for the newsletter, there's no need for you to do so again. But I do see some new faces, so hopefully some of you will find that interesting. I'm going to send that around this way. We also have some items for sale if you'd like to support our work that way. We have this lovely tote bag, which you can use to carry several books, including Democracy at Work by Richard Wolff, Occupy the Economy, also by Richard Wolff, coincidentally. If you'd like to purchase one of these items, I'm here. I'll be here all night. And if you'd prefer to just say hello, that's fine too. I'm right here in the corner. Again, my name is Shane. And one just sort of housekeeping note. Since we are shooting with video camera, we have a cable running along this side, an electrical wire, power cord. So if you're using that side of the room, just be aware of that. Thank you very much. Without further ado, this is Richard Wolff. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's just very nice to see the size of the audience growing, and I take it that that's a sign that the revolution is maturing. I want to remind you of that remarkable ad that you can see in the subways of New York, produced by a local storage company with a real imagination, that reads, simple block print, the French aristocracy didn't see it coming either. But it's all over the New York's subways, and it's testimony to the fact that there are people who see things. Couple of announcements before we jump in. At the end of this month, there will be this year's edition of the Left Forum. For those of you not familiar, but even for those of you who are, this is the largest annual gathering of left activists and academics in the United States. By some calculations, it's the largest one in the United States, including Europe. We will have, the Left Forum will have somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people gathering on the last 2 days of this month and the 1st of June, which are a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the last weekend in effect of this month. The location is different from last year. It's not at Pace University downtown. It's at the John Jay College of the City University of New York, which is located on the far west end of 59th Street. Very easy to get to by subway. You go to the Columbus Circle subway where a lot of lines come together there, and then it's about a 3-block walk west towards the Hudson River, and you're there. Very modern building. We will have approximately between 350 and 400 panels organized. The major speakers will include Harry Belafonte, Angela Davis, the musical group Immortal Technique, Amy Goodman, Kashama Sawant, that's the woman who won the city council seat in Seattle, who is coming here for that, Chris Hedges, Barbara Bowen, Cornel West, Laura Flanders, David Harvey, Marina Citrin, Rob Robinson, Stanley Aronowitz, Bernd Reisinger. I want to say a word about Bernd Reisinger, since I guess the name doesn't mean it much to you. He's one of the 2 leaders of the Die Linke party in Germany. It is Europe's most important and most powerful anti-capitalist party. Because they did well in the last general election in Germany, getting 1 out of 12 votes in the country, under German law, they are in the parliament. If you get more than 5% of the vote in Germany as a political party, you get the same number of seats in the parliament that you get in the popular vote. It's not the American system. It's called proportional representation, and it means that 1 out of the 12 members of the German parliament are the Die Linke party, one of whose slogans is Germany can do better than capitalism. So this is an unusual political party. It's done very well in Germany. It also sits in the parliament of some of the states, they call them Länder in Germany, of that country. It's a serious political party, and the head of that, one of the two heads, they have a man and a woman co-chair of the party. We had the woman last year, and this is the man this year, and I think you'll find it very interesting what they're going to do. And as I say, an additional 400 pounds. I'm asking Jamie over here to hand out these little flyers that give you a quick overview. Leftforum.org will give you all the details you could possibly want about this. Okay. Let me begin, as we always do, by talking to you about a few minor issues, but I think are very significant about where the economy has been going. It's only a couple of weeks, I guess, since we were last together in this room. So it hasn't been that long a time, and yet there have been a lot of interesting statistics and information, and I wanted to go over them briefly with you before we get to the major topics of the night. A certain milestone was reached, even in the last 2 weeks, in terms of data. First, the World Bank and other statistical organizations indicate that 2014 is the year that the gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services achieved by the People's Republic of China, will exceed that of the United States of America for the first time. And I think it is something for you to think about, what it means that a country that was so recently as poor and backward in all the dimensions of technical economics should have been able to achieve in the last 20 years, because that's basically when most of this was achieved, a spectacular increase. At an enormous social cost, no doubt, with consequences we can't even begin to figure out or measure. But nonetheless, it's a bald, basic fact that is going to have ramifications for decades to come. At the same time, today, another sign of the same thing. Today, on the stock markets of the world, it was announced by the world's largest, or one of the world's, it may be the world's largest internet company, but certainly the largest new stock holding announcement was made by something you may not have noticed, but you should, called the Alibaba Corporation. The Alibaba is the Chinese equivalent of what we would here call, I don't know, AOL, Amazon, eBay, all rolled into one. It is a huge Chinese corporation. The announcement today indicated that the price, the value of this IPO, IPO means initial public offering. It's when a company, for the first time, sells its shares to the public so that anybody who's an investor can get a piece of it. The value of this, and they filed it today, which means they will have the actual opening sometime in the next 90 days. That's what the filing today means. Their estimate at this point is it will be worth $160 billion, a staggering amount of money, and far in excess of anybody else doing anything like that. So we have the biggest IPO of the year is Chinese, a Chinese company whose market is in China, whose employees are overwhelmingly in China. They deliver all the packages in China. They have a special relationship to the Chinese military, which is one of their major investors. The American company who some years ago realized that this was the wave of the future, went in, gave them money, and got in exchange 24% of that company, the name of that American company, is Yahoo, which will have a ability to revive itself and grow into God knows what by virtue of the waterfall of money descending upon them, thanks to the ability of Alibaba to be the monster in China that it is. So that's one thing, the shifting relative position of the United States economically relative to the Chinese. The second item I want to bring to your attention, a little item, is from Great Britain. It's an initiative of the Conservative government in Great Britain. And I mention it not only because it's interesting for you to know that this sort of thing is happening, but because I have a strong suspicion that this will be coming here. And this is from The Guardian, the British newspaper. The Guardian from Monday the 5th of May, so yesterday's Guardian. England has pioneered something called the zero-hour contract. And what this means is you sign a contract to work for an employer, but the employer isn't required to either give you any specific number of hours or any specific hourly pay. It's very important, you'll see in a minute. You basically sign a contract to be on standby and to get hired if and when the employer you sign the contract with wishes you for a number of hours that he wishes at a pay that he wishes. The whole thing is wishes, anyway. The Office of the Minister of Labor has just announced that their new policy will be if a worker without work refuses to take a zero-hour contract available in his or her area, they will be denied unemployment compensation. In other words, if you're unemployed, you have to sign such a contract if it's available, because if you don't, you will have your benefits withdrawn. This is a really short number of steps from slavery. It's not quite there yet, but it's heading in a direction. I thought you would be interested that last week the Office for National Statistics, that's the agency of the British government that does this kind of research, it's like the Bureau of Labor Statistics in this country, more or less, revealed that the number of contracts now outstanding of these zero-hour contracts had reached 1.4 million. So you already have a significant number of British people on this. More than 1 in 10 employers are using such contracts, which are most likely to be in the areas of fast food. You can see where this kind of thing would be. So the notion that you can command a person to basically be on a standby contract. If it's a contract, it means when the employer says, okay, I got 18 hours at X dollars, you've got to go. So you're waiting. And if you don't sign the contract that obliges you to go, then you will not be eligible for the governmental supports to unemployed people. The Labour Party in England, to be fair, has yelled and screamed about this, but the Labour Party doesn't have the votes, and so it is expected to go through. Next item. And remember, please, what I've asked you on a few occasions, I don't want to keep repeating myself. If what I have to tell you is distressing, please remember, I am just the messenger. The British Medical Journal, which is equivalent to our AMA journal, is called The Lancet, Lancet. And in the latest issue of The Lancet, this was brought to my attention, there's an article done by lots and lots of researchers that compare maternal death in childbirth rates across the whole world. That's, by the way, one of the standard measures of the health and general medical care of a society, how many women die giving birth to a child. Okay. In 2013, as a sign of something, in the United States, 18.5 mothers died for every 100,000 live births. 18.5 mothers died for every 100,000 births. In Saudi Arabia last year, the rate was 7. In the United Kingdom, the rate was 6.1. 3 times more women die in childbirth in the United States than die that way in England. The U.S. was one of only 8 countries to see their rates of maternal mortality increase between 1990 and 2013. I thought you might like me to read to you the other 7 countries so that you understand the company we are keeping as a nation. Here we go. Afghanistan, Greece, El Salvador, South Sudan, and the tiny countries of Belize in Central America, Guinea-Bissau, and the Seychelles Islands, and the United States. Must mean something. Next item. This is from the Bloomberg Financial Services. I only mention it because I want you to know where the information comes from, lest you imagine that I take it from dubious sources. This one is a Bloomberg from today, May 6th. Here's an interesting story that also, I think, tells us a lot about what's happening in America. During the boom, the period 2001 or 2 to the crash and even into the crash, Americans did a remarkable thing often in order to increase their ability to buy goods and services. Wages were not going up anymore. In fact, they were going down. The American dream was becoming more and more elusive for Americans. So they did in the last 10 years, basically in this century, even more of what they had already been doing in the 20 or 30 years before the end of the last century. Namely, they borrowed. And one of the favorite ways to borrow was a home equity line of credit. Basically what that meant is if you were lucky enough to own a home, you would go to the bank and you would borrow money against the value of your home. The bank would make you a loan, taking as collateral the house that you offered it for that. And it meant that the share of your house that you actually owned was shrinking because you were literally pulling the value of the house out of the house to use for your current spending. So now imagine what happens if we have the kind of crash we do and people lose their homes, the value of their homes drops drastically. They can't do it. Here are the numbers just for you to have in your mind a rough idea. The amount of home equity loans outstanding in 2007 dropped by 38% to 2013. In other words, more than a third of the value of the homes moved in such a way that the credit was wiped out, either because you lost the home altogether or because you are in a new situation and you can't do it. And basically what it has meant is that when you wipe away the value of homes like that we did in this crash, and you change the conditions of people, and you make it harder to go to the bank and borrow because the banks are less and less willing to lend, partly because the value of the houses is low and going down, and they could be in danger if they lent you money because the house that's the collateral is dropping value. What are Americans to do? And it's interesting what they've done. It doesn't show up in the debt statistics. So if you have a shallow analyst, he or she will say, oh, debts on Americans are not borrowing more money. Well, it isn't true. They are borrowing more, but it's hidden. It's not in the form of the housing. They're not pulling money out of their houses because their houses aren't worth enough. And they're not pulling money out of any other asset except one, which is what the new statistics show. And I thought you'd be interested. Where are Americans now going to get the money to enable them to live in the lifestyle that neither their wages nor their conventional ability to borrow make possible? Because their wages are flat to declining and their capacity to borrow is shrinking. And the answer is they're going into their 401k retirement accounts. And I thought the numbers here were stunning. Okay? Give you an example. In 2011, the Internal Revenue Service in the United States collected $5.7 billion revenue to the federal government from the penalties imposed on people who are pulling their money out of the 401k before they're legally allowed to. If you go and try to take money out of your 401k, they will explain to you at the bank or wherever you are that if you do this, you're going to pay a penalty and it's going to be this. So urgent is the need of folks to get the money for their basic life that they're paying at an incredible rate. Another statistic. As of March 31st of this year, the median size, the median means 50% have more and 50% have less. The median size of a 401k plan held by an American citizen is $24,400. That is what half of the people have, that or less as what their pension is as of today. If you look at people older than 55, so those that are closer to this event, it's still $65,000. That is 50% of Americans have less than $65,000, and this is at a time when you couldn't possibly live on Social Security unless you and cat food have an affinity to one another, and even then you'd have to buy the cheap kind of cat food. Okay, remember I'm just the messenger here. Okay. Home sales. I thought I could give you a glimpse into the recovery that you keep hearing about, and that as the election gets closer, you're going to hear much more about. If I gave you a statistic about house sales, and I thought this is also from Bloomberg, 2nd of May release on the Bloomberg Financial Survey. By the way, some of you have asked me to tell you where the statistics are. I hate to say it since I'm no fan of the mayor, ex-mayor, but the Bloomberg Financial News is an extraordinarily good source of statistical and other kinds of economic reporting. So if you're looking for a way, all free, they're all every day, lots of material, but it's extraordinary what you can learn. Here's what I thought you might be interested in. Simple statistic, but yet I think it reveals a lot. Houses cost, homes, that is co-ops, condos, and self-standing houses, independently standing houses, that cost $1 million or more over the last year, from March 2013 to March 2014, purchases of houses over $1 million rose by 7.8%. So there has been a good, not overwhelming, but a good increase in purchases of homes across the United States of homes worth $1 million. Transactions for homes worth $250,000 or less, which represent 2/3 of the housing market of the United States over the same period, dropped by 12%. Okay? So if you have a house worth $1 million or more, you are in good shape. If you have a house worth $250,000 or less, which 2/3 of American homes are, then you are in a place which we technically call deep doo-doo. It's a technical term in economics. It's not good.
Does it say the location? I mean, it's...
No, this is for the whole country.
Yeah, but it seems like $1 million is New York, and you have to almost pay that. And lower cost houses are outside of New York.
Perfect. So what does it tell you? It tells you that
New Yorkers can afford.
New York is becoming. That's right. New York is the place where people either are or are coming to give you the impression you might get walking around Manhattan. But the impression you might get walking around Manhattan has to be weighed against the reality for the vast majority of people, which is the last year is not a recovery. A decline of 12% is a staggering drop in the demand for housing. Nobody can buy the cheap houses. The only people who can buy houses are those who are buying $1 million plus houses. It tells you that the recovery is for that group, the top 5%, 1%, whatever you want, but there's not only no recovery for everybody else, the average American, there's a continued decline. I read dozens of stories over the last year about the housing market lifting a bit, but it's not true. The minute you disaggregate, you break down housing into the million plus and the others, you see that the recovery is about a tiny fraction of the market, of the people, of the economy, and the majority are in the opposite condition. And the last short item for today, before we go into the big topics, is about Miami. Now, you know, because those of you that have come here before, that from time to time I have talked over the last year about the city of Detroit. I talk about the city of Detroit not only because it is such a staggering emblem of what has gone wrong in American capitalism over the last 40 years of decline, a city that is now in official bankruptcy, the largest urban bankruptcy in the history of the United States. And again, remind you, Detroit in 1960 was the center of the most dynamic, powerful capitalist industry in the world, the automobile industry. It was the pride of the United States. It was what distinguished the United States from all the other countries, a mass population able to buy the automobiles that a working class produced. It was a city of 2 million people. It was the first city that, in a sense, really brought African Americans into the American working class, got them a good job, a job that was comparable in pay to what a lot of white workers got, made them part of the United Auto Workers, which was the most powerful union in the country at the time, et cetera, et cetera. And here we are, 40 or 50 years later, and Detroit population went from 2 million in 1960 to 700,000 people. You drove the majority of people out of this city. You made it unlivable. No job, no home, no city services, nothing. So people were driven out no matter what their roots in the community, their family, their churches, their kids' schooling, didn't make any difference. And I think I've told you, as I have others, because it's such a wonderful metaphor, that one of the biggest problems in Detroit today is the problem of wild dogs. 50,000, I didn't make this up. I wouldn't have had the imagination to make this up. 50,000 wild dogs. Why? Because millions, literally, hundreds of thousands of families leaving the city can't afford to take Fido with them, however much they like Fido. So they look the other way and Fido stays behind. Fido's fine because there's so many abandoned houses, Fido very quickly finds a place to live. And he usually finds Fida, who's there too. Whereupon Fido and Fida do what those kinds of people do, or dogs in this case. And so they have an enormous number. Meanwhile, the city has no money, so it lays off the dog wardens. Those are the people who are supposed to keep track of that problem. So the dogs multiply, and there's no constraint on them, and now you have a problem of 50,000 wild. What a statement. Center, peak of the greatest achievement of capitalist industry in America is now a city besieged by wild dogs. I mean, if a playwright wrote that, you'd think he or she was exaggerating in a way that isn't artistic. Okay? Think about it. Well, Miami gives us another glimpse of this kind of thing. There's a building boom in Miami, for those of you that are not aware of it. Large parts of Miami are being grabbed for very expensive, tall condo projects. Most of these are financed by people in other parts of the world, in particularly by money from Venezuela, Hong Kong, and Argentina. Why? Well, wealthy people around the world have for a long time wanted to hold a portion of their wealth in the United States. The reason for that is it is deemed to be a safer place to hold your wealth than their own country. They know real well how secure they are in their own country and want to get a nice slice of their wealth out of there, just in case something were to go badly wrong in those societies. So they want to hold wealth here. And one of the ways to hold wealth here is to become an investor in real estate. And Miami is the place. So how is it working? Miami is becoming a nation of extremes, in the sense that they're pushing the poor into smaller and smaller conclaves of highly intense population, very dense, to free up the land for the others. So you have the richest people on earth building fancy apartments and occupying them, or renting them, or selling them to other wealthy investors around the world. Meanwhile, the working class that has to clean the place and build the place. So here's an interesting statistic that jumped out at me. Economists use something called the Gini coefficient. It's a statistic, and what it does is measure the degree of inequality. So Miami is now the third highest. That means the third most unequal city. The third most unequal city in the United States in terms of the gap between rich and poor. Okay? And I thought you might like to know who are number one and number two. Ready? No, this is going to hurt the feelings of those of you from the southern United States. Number one unequal United States city, Atlanta. Number two, New Orleans. Number three, Miami. And to give you an idea of what this means, the Gini coefficient for these cities, all three of them, is roughly what it is in Mexico City, which is not as good, that is more unequal than, for example, Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. The United States didn't used to be in that company any more than it used to be in that company when it comes to maternal death in childbirth.
Where is New York on that list?
I don't know. They didn't give us New York. In this release, there is no New York. But I'm sure you could find it. And as I say, if you go to Bloomberg, May 2nd, there's this story, and you can track it from here, get that statistic. Okay. Let me turn then to the bigger topics for tonight. And I'm going to do the order a little bit differently. I'm going to start by talking about the book that is getting so much attention that it seems to me we ought to spend a little bit of time on it, since you're thinking about it and reading about it or hearing about it. So let's do a little work on Monsieur Thomas Piketty is his name. In the French language, you don't pronounce the S at the end. It's not Thomas, it's Thomas. Okay? Let me tell you about Thomas, in English, Thomas Piketty. He's a French research economics professor. European universities typically have a separation between the research professor and the teaching professor. It's not like the United States where you're expected to do both, even if you're competent in neither. But it's required that you do both. The Europeans recognize human limitations. But he mostly does research. And for most of his life, his adult life as a specialist, he has done research together with an American professor, Emmanuel S-A-E-Z, Saez. Emmanuel Saez is a professor of economics at the University of California in Berkeley. And together, Piketty and Saez, over about 25 years, have become the go-to specialists on the analysis of wealth and income distribution in the United States, in Western Europe, and pretty much globally. If you go Google Saez and Piketty, either way, you'll come to their website. Their website is a very impressive compendium of the research. They constantly update it. If you're interested, that's the place to go, where most people today, academics, government officials, if you want to have reliable statistics on the distribution of wealth and income, Saez and Piketty, for those of you Thomas Piketty, they're the ones. Okay, so that's the first thing. And they've established quite a reputation. Then Mr. Piketty, alone, decided to write a book. And because in Europe, this is slightly mean, what I'm about to say. Out of character, I assure you. Slightly mean. In a European university, it is, in France anyway, it is necessary to indicate to people, I just say this because it's not America, that you have read the work of Karl Marx. If you say with pride, as most of my American fellow economists say, that they have never read that, you would be considered a moron. This is not because you agree with Marx, it's just important that you have read the Marx. And it is even more important that you flirt with Marx. So Mr. Piketty calls his book, of all the titles he could think of, Capital, which does reminiscent of a book by Karl Marx called Capital. But Piketty's cute, so he calls it Capital in the 21st Century. So he is updating, but it's clear who he's flirting with. But flirting is the right word because it doesn't go any further than that. There's no further relationship between him and Marx other than a flirtation. What is the point of the book? The point of the book is to say two things. One, that the conventional economic theory that most economists use is in fact fine. It's okay. The basic concepts are the right ones. But economists have not used them in the right way, so that if you look at the actual history of what has happened in capitalism, you see that the theory is good, but it needs to be reconfigured a little bit to be more in line with what the statistics show. And since he's the most famous statistician of the subject of income inequality and wealth inequality, he's going to confront the profession with what the empirical record is that they have to come to terms with. And the empirical record is that capitalism, and he does this across the countries, and he goes back in history. The book is daunting, by the way, for those of you contemplating buying it. It runs in excess of 600 pages. 600 pages of a book by a statistician. You want to think about that. Probably a long time. But if you're interested, here's what he does. His statistics show, and if you've followed his work, which I have, you'll see that it's an extension of what he's been doing for a long time. What he shows is that capitalism, as it has actually functioned, has been an economic system that has consistently, over 100, 200 years, delivered growing inequality of wealth and income. In other words, built into capitalism, the way it's operated, is a tendency reproduced year after year, decade after decade, country after country, for more and more inequality. And that the only times, which have been rare, when that growing inequality was interrupted, and that's how he sets it up, it's an interruption, has been when there have been massive political interventions by the government to reverse this. One of the key examples, not the only one, but one of the key examples is the United States. When? The Great Depression. When there was an intervention by the government, Roosevelt's government, that radically altered the inequality. But Piketty's point is they did it, they were able to undo some of the inequality that had been building in the decades before the Great Depression. But no sooner had they done it than the underlying inequality mechanisms kicked back in, and so we have the last 40 years when the same thing reasserted itself and the inequalities are with us again. From that, Piketty concludes, and now you will understand why people like Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, Democrats, love this. He says, therefore, if, and this is important, if you want, you the reader of his work, if you want to do something about the growing inequality in the United States, if you think that's unethical, immoral, socially dangerous, whatever's in your mind, then you really got no option but to once again massively intervene in the capitalist system to slow, or if possible, reverse the inequality that the system, like an engine, keeps producing. And he therefore concludes his book by advocating a sharply increased level of taxation on high incomes and taxation on high ownership of wealth. Income tax, wealth tax. Okay? So there he is. He is the incarnation of what every good American liberal wants. A prestigious economist in France. Now that, of course, makes you a little suspicious. He's French. You know, they eat frogs, things like that. But nonetheless, because he's hooked into a professor at California, Berkeley, which, if you know about the rankings of economics departments, is one of the 10 or 20 best in this country. At least they have that reputation. So he is acceptable. And Paul Krugman has written 10, 15 times about how wonderful this is, and so have all the other, like Robert Reich, all the usual suspects have lined up to endorse this wonderful breakthrough and to make fun of conservatives. Why are they making fun of conservatives? Well, the major reason is that one of the basic arguments that people who love capitalism, theorists, economists, my colleagues, who are big boosters of capitalism, one of the things they have enjoyed saying over and over again, teaching me in school and teaching to my next door to me when we are both professors, is that capitalism is a system that brings, the word they used to use a lot, convergence. Basically, that capitalism is an equalizer. For those of you that were alive way back in the 1960s or 50s, you know, if you can remember dimly that, you will know that one of the biggest celebrations of American capitalism was that it had created, so the words went, a middle class. That isn't capitalism wonderful? Because the average American worker had a house, had a car, had a refrigerator, and so forth and so on, whereas average working people in many other countries didn't have those things, or had older, or smaller, or fewer of them. So that American capitalism created, sure, it made some rich people, but what was really stunning was its creation of a less unequal society than we had inherited from feudalism or pre-capitalist societies. So that the longer you had capitalism going, the more robust the capitalism, the more it would create and enlarge and support a middle class that could enjoy the achievements of modern technology. What Mr. Piketty is saying is, not the way it works. Whatever you think of capitalism, and both Piketty and Saez are happy with modern capitalism. It is true that Mr. Piketty is a member, this is going to hurt, of the French Socialist Party. But the word socialist in France is a relaxed term. It has about the same political bite as saying that you like wine or something like it. It's a very broad term. It's like saying in the United States, because you're a member of the Democratic Party, you are therefore a Democrat with a little d, even though you joined the party with the big D. But you all know that the commitment of Democrats with a big D to democracy with a little d is a variable and rough and wooshy kind of connection. Well, that, when a French person says, I'm a socialist, the relationship between that and what most of you probably think about socialism is very vague and uncertain and broad and diffuse. I'm being as polite as I know how. These are not anti-capitalists. The profession is not upset by their work because they go out of their work to say, I'm part of this. I'm part of the profession. I'm proud that I'm a professor at Berkeley. I'm proud that I'm a professor in France. The basic concepts of the theory that we were taught we are using, which they do. We're endorsing by our use, which they are. But you have to see that if you look at it this way, it has this unfortunate result, but don't worry, we can fix it. We can redistribute income from the rich to the poor, from the wealthy to the middle. We just need a tax, a progressive tax structure to accomplish the redistribution, and we're home free. And my work, says Piketty, is to show you that if we don't interfere, we continue to rely on capitalism's internal mechanisms, we're going to get even more inequality. So the conservative notion, the market is a wonderful institution, let it do its thing, get the government out, Mr. Piketty is clearly saying, oh, no, don't do that. And the implicit message, and you find it on many pages between the lines, is the following argument, which you're going to hear more in the United States in the months and years to come. It's the liberal argument when you keep pushing the liberals into a corner. And the answer is, this society cannot be sustained on a foundation of inequality on this scale. And the next step, if you let it go, is violence in the streets. So you conservatives, say the liberals, you damn well better let us intervene massively or we're all going down. The system is going to blow up. Okay? And I think Mr. Piketty is an advanced guard, and the reason liberals in America like him, at least most of them, is they see that he gives them a powerful hammer to drive that point home. Okay? Now, who's similar? What should this remind you of? Well, I'm an economics professor, so it jumps up at me, and in case it didn't with you, let me show you. This is a rerun in our century of almost exactly the behavior and the origin and the role of John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s. Mr. Keynes comes out of the established economics profession. His father was a famous economist. He was a famous economist. He was a professor at Cambridge University, which is as fancy as it gets in England. Oxford and Cambridge, he's at Cambridge. Okay? So he comes and he's an expert in the conventional economics, but he says, whoa, we, the collective of the we've made a mistake. We said that a breakdown of the system couldn't happen. And we said if it did happen, it would be self-corrected by the automatic mechanisms of capitalism that are self-correcting. But, he says, look around. We've been waiting for it to self-correct from 1929 when it hits to 1930, 31, 32, 33. He's getting desperate. He writes the book. It's published in 1936. And he says, we've made a terrible mistake. It turns out, he says, that our theory is all, he didn't question the basic theory, not at all. But we have to see that under certain circumstances, this theory shows us that capitalism can produce massive, sustained unemployment with all that goes with that. There it is. Capitalism produces and repeatedly produces mass unemployment, crises, business cycle downturns, recessions, doesn't matter what words you want to use. He said we've got to, but he said, don't worry, I got a fix. We can take care of it. And what is it he suggests? Massive government intervention. The central bank should step in and flood the economy with money and drive down interest rates. Hello. That's what we've been doing, isn't it? That's Keynesian economics. Number two, the government should come in there and spend money like there's no tomorrow. That's called the stimulus program. Bush and Obama did that too. And that will get us out. But we better, said Keynes, we better do it, because if we don't flood the economy with money, no matter what the dangers of doing that, and if we don't stimulate the economy, we're going to have such a level of unemployment that the system is going to blow. So again, the liberal to the conservative, you better let us massively intervene, or else we all go down with the capitalist ship. Mr. Piketty is doing that again. Only his argument isn't about the economic downturn. His argument is about the long-term trend to inequality. Other than that, same argument. With the same people lining up. Okay? Hang with me for a minute. What's the problem here? What is the problem here? I think the problem here is a combination of economics, but also of history. I mean, folks, we have been there, and we've done that. Mr. Piketty wants us to levy high taxes on income. He wants us to levy high taxes on wealth. Just a reminder again, and I know I've done this before, and some of you've heard it before, but you can hear it again. We've already done that. Part of what Roosevelt did in the 30s was raise taxes on wealth and income. That's how we paid for Social Security, which was created in the middle of the 30s. That's how the government paid for unemployment compensation, which was started in the 1930s. That's how the government paid the wages and salaries of all the people that the government hired, the 15 million people hired by the government, workers for the federal government in the middle of the Depression. That was paid for by taxing and borrowing from the rich, who were told, yeah, you're going to pay high taxes and you're going to lend us the rest. And if you don't lend us the rest, we're going to tax it from you. So you're going to get it one way or the other. So be happy you can lend it to us, because the alternative is we're going to take it from you. Whoa. Sir?
Could you just clarify something? Because I'm aware, obviously, that Roosevelt increased taxes on income. But I'm not aware, and as I understand, Piketty wants to tax wealth in some kind of way. When did Roosevelt tax wealth?
Not so much the wealth. He was mostly went after the income of individuals and the income of corporations. You will remember, though, that we had already a tax on wealth. It wasn't very well enforced, but we have had a tax on wealth all the way through the 20th century, because that comes out of an earlier upsurge of people, the populist movement in the South and Midwest, which had that old argument, which Americans have conveniently forgotten, which is everybody should start on a level playing field. So everybody who reaches their youth, when you get to be, 20 years of age, you should have the same chance as everybody else, which means we should all have the same amount of money to use to help us make a life and a career. Obviously, this doesn't work if a rich person can leave to his or her child a ton of money and the next person has parents who don't have anything. So the argument was the way you create a level playing field, the only basis for a meritocracy, that is, an arrangement where your capability and your merit is what gets you ahead, that the only way to have a democratic meritocracy, everybody has an equal chance to do the best he or she can with their abilities and their brains and their muscles, is you must have, ready, a confiscatory, it's what it's called, wealth tax on inheritance. So you make a lot of money, have a nice time. When you die, your kids, they got to start more or less like everybody else. Is that 100% effective? Obviously not. But it is a step in that direction. Right? So this has been a target of wealthy people to get rid of it. And like with everything else, wealthy people, strategy 1, get around it, evade it. Strategy 2, modify it. Strategy 3, if you're strong enough, eliminate it. So today, the federal inheritance tax lets you have your first $5 million. This should relax many of you. The first $5 million you can pass to your kids without an inheritance tax. And in case that did work, I can see some of you are looking very worried. It's about to go to 10. One of the wonderful breakthroughs of the current leadership in Washington is to raise it to 10. So I can see already a relaxation in some of you. That extra 5 you thought might be hit is not. But if you know anything about this, you'll know that the game that has been played with wealth tax, it's a very interesting question, has basically been in this country to allow there to be a wealth tax, but only on the average person and not on the rich. I think I've done that with you before, but let me do it again because I can see some of you don't understand that. In the United States, there is a tax on wealth. It's what the local governments in the United States do, the city and the town. If you live in a city and a town, and if you're an American, it'd be hard for you to live anywhere else. If you live in a city and a town, you actually may not be aware, but the structure in which you live, the building, the house, has a value assessed. There's an official in every town in America who's called a tax assessor. And his or her job is to go around and estimate the value of your house, your condo, your co-op. And there's a record in every town in America of what your property is worth. And the city raises most of its money, towns and cities in America, by taxing the value of your wealth in the form of a house, in the form of a car, in the form of a business inventory, that kind of thing. So we have a tax on wealth, but only at the local level. States don't tax wealth, and the federal government does not tax wealth. States and the federal government tax income and expenditure, when you spend money and when you earn it, but it doesn't tax your wealth. But here's the interesting thing for those of you who've never thought about it. We have a wealth tax, but only on land, houses, business inventories, and automobiles. What's missing? Stocks, bonds, and cash. And here comes the thing which, if I had more time, as I've told you in the past, I would stop at this moment. We'd have a moment of 30 seconds of silence, and before I go on, I'd play the national anthem. Okay? No level of government in the United States taxes wealth in the form of stocks, bonds, and cash. No government does that. We only tax houses and cars, which are, of course, the property that average Americans have. If they have any property, that's what they have. That's what we tax. We do not tax the wealth of the rich, which is mostly in the form of stocks, bonds, cash, and so on. It's like sales taxes. We have sales taxes. If you buy a radio, if you buy sneakers, you pay a price, and then there's a sales tax, which here in New York, last I looked, is 8.25% or something like 8.5%, something, what is it? 8.8? Okay, so those are heavy. Well, the question has been raised by revolutionaries that why don't the people who buy and sell shares of stock, those big banks that do, trillions of transactions of buying, selling, why don't, here's a thought, why don't they have a sales tax on what they buy and sell? And if you don't understand why not, then I don't know what planet you live on. They don't, because, as they are quite clear in saying, they don't want to. And it turns out that because they don't want to, and they have the power that they do, they don't. So let's go back, yeah.
I just want to try to not blame the messenger, but just add another little dimension here that you've commented on before. As I understand it, when you started writing Democracy at Work, your idea was that the way out of exploitive capitalism was a form of working people, which means all of us in this room, taking charge of the production
Right.
process. Okay? All right. Now, that's very positive.
Yes.
It's very empowering for me to hear that as a human being, okay? I just need to really put this out because I'm getting pissed at you. No, I am serious. I'm really
No.
serious.
I was about to get to that with the critique
Okay,
of
I'm not
Piketty.
blaming the messenger, but I'm really just talking here.
Right.
And the other thing that you talked about, when you talked about that, was that the social movements of the 30s, and there were massive social movements of the 30s that were very powerful, and in fact were, in their minds, wanted to challenge capitalism
Yes.
in a kind of vague, uncommunicative, among ourselves way. But what happened was that Roosevelt saw that if he didn't step in and take control of corporations and limit their power, that the shit was going to hit the fan.
Right.
And that's what he used to negotiate with the corporations. And here's the main point: those social movements said okay. That they went along and they agreed to that. They agreed to the labor laws that said, okay, corporations get to say this, and we get this. Now, it seems to me that what that says, and everybody's going to hate me now, is that those social movements made an agreement, either consciously or unconsciously, or because of the way our limits on our capacity to self-organize, said, agreed, we'll go along with capitalism. Now you've got to say that. You've
Okay.
got to say that. I am really tired of hearing lefties constantly blaming the system and never once giving us
No.
a creative self-criticism so that we can creatively move on and organize ourselves. And instead of saying, giving all this.
Says it once a month.
Anyway,
Let me try to respond. I agree with almost everything that you've had to say, and I've told this story on more than one occasion in my analyses. Every part of what you say is correct. The only way I would shade it a little bit differently is it's a question not of so much of the organization. The labor movement, the socialist parties, the Communist Party, the 1930, they were good organizers. They did organize huge numbers of people, and they did focus them, and they did a lot. And I'm mostly very impressed and deferential to what they accomplished. And I think they went as far as what they thought they could do. Now that may have been
That's what I'm saying.
what they thought they could do, and try to imagine us, move forward into our time. Suppose we got a president, whether it was Obama or somebody else, who actually did the equivalent of a Roosevelt, who did not talk about helping masses of people avoid being foreclosed out of their home, but actually did it. Did not permit the Republicans to block all the different things, or at least tried in a massive way to prevent that. We might be so taken with what we were able to get that we wouldn't take that next step and say, this really isn't about a policy intervention, this has to go further. Let me finish. The way with Piketty is very clear. He wants us to do it again. It's your point. He wants us to get all mobilized and excited to impose another high tax on incomes and another high tax on wealth, and to use the money to help the middle class that is in such trouble. That's what happened in the 1930s, and when the dust cleared, and here's the big punchline, the system hadn't changed. The different amounts of money that one side of the system got had been reduced for a while. You did go against the trend that Piketty shows us capitalism has. But because you didn't change the underlying system, your redistribution strategy, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, provoked in the rich the perfectly understandable and predictable commitment to undo what had just been done to them. And because you left them in control of the corporations, they had the resources, the profits, to do what you had just given them the incentive to do, and they did it. They spent the last 40 years using the profits of their corporations to undo, to buy the political system. We all see that. All Americans see, all the polls show it. We now see as a nation that those at the top have bought the political process precisely because they understand better than most Americans that as a system becomes more and more unequal, the people at the top are becoming more and more vulnerable. They better control the political system or else it will be used against them. How? Exactly how it happened in the 30s when the labor unions, the socialists, and the communists went to the president and said, we got 40 million people here. You better do something. And Roosevelt realized, as you put it nicely, you better. And you left the system alone. So what do I conclude? And what is my critique of Piketty? But before I say it, I appreciate that Piketty is making us all cognizant and excited about income inequality and making it clear that it's built into the system. These are things I'm very grateful. Makes my job much easier. But I have also to be very harsh with him because there's not a word of a fundamental systemic critique in there. He doesn't want he doesn't see that even if we did what he said, which we once did, we leave in position a system, it'll undo what we do. And you know something? The American working class really went out on a limb in the 30s to fight for what they got. Having seen it lost, they're not going to do that again. They're not going to do, I don't believe it. They've been, let me finish. They've been there and they've done that. And they're not going to do it again. We, the left, have to provide something that looks like it will work better than what happened last time, because to do that again isn't an appealing. That's why the liberals in America are so frustrated. They're so isolated. They're so weak. They're so small. Why even Obama says to the liberals, you know, you want me to do more than, but you don't put any pressure on me. You haven't mobilized the people. Make it easy for me to do what you want, and I'll do it. I mean, who knows whether it's true or not. But he has a point. The liberals don't know, because they can't mobilize a mass population. One of the things that happened over the last 50 years was that the constituency of the left in America, the working class mobilized by the labor movement, the socialists, and the communists, very important to understand, they became disgusted with what the Democrats weren't able to do. They weren't able to, not only not able to go further along the lines of what they wanted in the way of a middle class, they couldn't even preserve what they had won in the 30s and 40s. As soon as the war was over, they started losing it, and they couldn't. And there were people who backed away. The constituents of the left became angry, disappointed, disillusioned, pulled away, making the left weaker, creating the space for the right to move in, and we've all lived the history that has come as a result. So for me, the reason I make the arguments I do and the books I write, everything I do, is to try to make the systemic critique of Piketty. The only way forward is to do something that ends a situation where there are people with every incentive to undo the redistribution, who have the profits coming into their hands that give them the wherewithal to realize what the incentives are. And how do you do that? You have to change the organization of production. There can't be a small group of people, shareholders, big shareholders, and boards of directors who control the enterprises, who draw into their hands the profits that everybody helps to make. It is the undemocratic nature of the enterprise, where a tiny group of people at the top draw it all into their hands and decide then to use it in a way I'm going to go through with you in a minute, to use it in a way that undoes the very program that the Pikettys and the Krugmans of the world want us to do. Keynes wanted to fix capitalism. How do I know that? He said that over and over again. He hated communists and socialists, and he said it. He didn't hide it. They had that kind of British, he did it with humor. He did it with humor, and he did it with a kind of sharp intensity. He wanted to save capitalism. And the irony was, as he liked to say, I want to save capitalism from itself. He made that, but Piketty is saying the same thing. I want to save capitalism from itself, its own tendency to a greater inequality that undercuts the social support for this system. I want to do it, but that's, for me, my answer is, you can't have that. You don't change the system, you get the result which history has shown us over and over again. That's what you got. You want to avoid this system's bad results, you can't tinker. You can't pass a law, you can't pass a regulation, you can't have a high tax, because you've left in place the underlying structure that undermines all of what you've done. You can't do it, and you've got to learn. The metaphor I find best for this is, if you win a military fight, you win the war, do you leave the country that you've defeated, the army you've defeated, in possession of all of its tanks and planes and guns? Only if you're crazy. Because those people are angry and upset and frustrated. They lost the war. They feel they could, they might, they should, they ought to fight back, and you're leaving them with the results of the war, let's say a heavy war debt, which gives them every incentive to undo that, and you're leaving them with the arms with which to realize their incentive to get out of this. So the answer has to be a structural change. And so I reread the history of the 30s by saying, imagine what they couldn't do, but what we can do if we learn the lesson. That we say, hey, it's not enough to have high tax. No, Mr. Piketty, not a high tax. We have to have in place a structure that we can have confidence in. If we put a high tax, it isn't going to be undone. The people who gather the discretionary money of the system, the profits, who decide what to do with them, they can't be in a position of a tiny minority, wealthy as hell, who then have the right to use the profits we all produce to make sure that we are excluded from the wealth as it accumulates. This is the critique of Keynes, this is the critique of Piketty. But before you leave tonight, give me this just 10 minutes. Because where this critique comes from is not me and not some clever reading of Piketty. This is basic Marxian economics. Now I know that may come as a trouble for some of you, since you know that Marx has horns and all the rest, but in point of fact, he figured something out. And I think I can render it for you in a few minutes, and you'll see how it makes this point. This rectangle represents work, production, the use of a human brain and muscle to transform nature, to take a tree and make a chair, to take a plant that grows cotton and make a shirt, you know, work, productive work. In every society, Marx says, in every society, some people, not everybody, does work. Some portion of the population uses their brains and muscles to transform nature to produce output. First idea of Marx, not terribly original. Number two, now we're getting original. He says in every society where people do work, those who do work, a subset of the community, I mean, obviously, right, doesn't include babies that are 12 months old because they don't really work real well, and it doesn't include old people and sick, a lot of people not included. But those people, some subset, who do the work, not only produce the goods and services, but in all societies, they produce more, this is crucial, than they themselves consume. The people who produce more than they consume. How do we know that? Because the only way people can live who don't produce is if they get some of what those who produce that's in excess of what they themselves consume. The excess, what all workers produce more than they consume, is what Marx called the surplus. No big difficulty here. What do the people who get the surplus do with it? Well, let's see. I could talk to you about how it works in a communist society, how it works in a slave society. I don't have the time. So I'm just going to talk about capitalism, which is what Marx was most interested in, too. So here's how it works, and the simplest story gets it best. When you go and sit with a private employer and you discuss what you're going to do, work in this software company or in this hamburger joint or whatever it is, you sit and you discuss, I'm going to come in Monday through Friday at 8 o'clock and stay till 5. You know, I'm going to work with this machine in this corner under these rules. And then you get to that key moment, how much are we going to get paid for this? And let's say, just for the simplicity, I'm going to get paid $20 an hour. At that moment, Marx says something which was a theoretical breakthrough, even though everybody knows this. But it's often true that the greatest breakthroughs are putting into words what we kind of all knew, but quite didn't see. Here's his idea. If you're going to be paid by an employer $20 an hour, the following statement must be true. During that hour, your labor produces more for the employer that he sells at the end of the day than $20 worth. Because that's why he's in the if paying you 20, you went to work and you did an output that gave another 20 for him to sell, then he's got nothing out of this. He's made 20 by selling what your labor helped to produce, but he's got to give it to you. And even though he likes you, he's not going to do that. There has to be in it, here we go, something for him. You have to produce, this is ineluctable, you have to produce more in every hour than you get paid. Otherwise, this system doesn't work. So for those of you, and I have to tell you this because partly you need to hear it and partly I admit I get a kick out of telling you. Those of you who think that in a capitalist system you're never going to work for anybody who doesn't pay you what you're worth, you don't understand the system you're in. That is never going to happen because that's how this system works. So that when you go home at the end of a workday and you feel vaguely ripped off, it's because you are. And the psychologist or others who helps you get over that feeling isn't doing you any favor. You need that feeling to fuel, well, it's very important, to fuel a recognition that that's what capitalist production is. You hire workers. Part of the time that they work, they produce an output that is given back to them at the end of the week. That's their wage. And part of it, that's your necessary labor. That's what Marx called it. The labor you do for your employer that's necessary for you because during that time you're producing something for the employer. You all do know, right? You produce for the employer for 8 hours. Then you go home and you leave in the workplace what you produce. Because if you take that home with you, what you produce, people in dark blue uniforms come to your house and they hurt you. Okay? So you learn, no, don't do that. You got to leave there what you did. It's not yours. As fast as you produce it, it belongs to somebody else. So you work part of the time for yourself. You produce value that's paid back to you as your wage. But the only reason the employer hires you is that part of the time you do surplus labor. You do work, brains and muscle, that produces value that is beyond what you're paid. You produced it, you don't get it. Again, you produced it, you don't get it. Who gets it? The employer gets it. He gets the surplus. Fast forward to General Motors. 100, 200,000 people producing surplus. Who gets it? The board of directors. How big is that? That's 15 people. That's the law in the United States and in all capitalism. 15 people draw into their hands the surplus of all the employees that are busy using their brains and muscles to make cars and trucks and all the other things General Motors makes. The board of directors, 12, 15 people, decide what to do with the surplus. And now, very quickly, part of it goes to the government in taxes. Profits tax on corporations. They have to, you know why? Because if they don't, the government comes, shuts them down. But that's not much of a discussion. But they do spend a lot of time trying to get that reduced, don't they? And now you know why. Because the less of the surplus they have to pay in taxes, the more of the surplus is available for what? Let's see. One of the other things you have to do with the surplus is pay managers. Managers don't make cars and trucks. They wouldn't have the faintest idea of how even to start. Their job is to do completely other things that don't produce anything. For example, the purchasing manager, what does he or she do? They go and buy the raw rubber and the raw steel and the other things that go into the car. They don't make anything. They're out there buying stuff. The sales manager, does he make anything? No. His job is to take the finished product, the car, and get rid of it, sell it to somebody. So you gotta have all these people doing this if the enterprise is gonna work, but they don't produce any value for you. So how do you pay them? You gotta take a part of the surplus produced by those workers who produce for you something that you sell, and you give it to the managers. And now here comes a real simple idea. If you can save on taxes, that's less of the surplus you gotta piss away as a capitalist on the taxes to the government, the more you can pay your top managers. Now there's an incentive. You tell your CEO, you get the taxes reduced, you get a bonus. The surplus that I would otherwise have to give the government, I give you. Where else is the surplus? It goes to the clerks, all those white-collar workers who keep records. You know, did you come in on time? The person who keeps a record of whether the workers come in on time, they don't produce cars or trucks. They do no productive work at all. They do work that the company has to have. Got to keep records of who showed up and who didn't. But they don't help produce anything. So they get paid by another piece of the surplus. Next to last. Shareholders. Part of the surplus that is earned by a company from all of its productive workers who make stuff, part of that is used and distributed to the shareholders, the owners of the company. I don't know how many of you understand corporate law, but this is how it works. The 15 people on the board of directors decide how much of the surplus is going to be paid out as dividends to the shareholders. The dividend paid by the 12 people, 100,000 produce that, and 12 people who are themselves not producers, or 15 on the board, they decide. By the way, under the law, the board of directors has the right to distribute nothing of the surplus to the shareholders. There are many big companies in America that regularly distribute nothing to the shareholder. No dividend. Okay? Zilch. Or they can deliver all of it. It's entirely them who decides. That's the law. And finally, they can take a part of the surplus and use it to what Marx called accumulate capital, grow the company. Now, please understand, What I have just told you is Marx's argument saying everything is about the employer, the board of directors, and the major shareholders. You know, most shares in American companies are owned by a tiny number of people. 1% of shareholders own 75% of the shares. So it's a tiny number of people. For most big corporations, a dozen or two major shareholders and 12 to 15 people on the board of directors selected by the shareholders. You get on the board of directors if the shareholders vote. Every year they vote. You get 1 vote per each share you own. If you own 1 million shares, you get 1 million votes. If you own no shares, you get no votes. Most workers at General Motors own nothing, or they own 12 shares that their grandmother gave them on their confirmation. They have therefore no power. But those who own big blocks of shares, they have all the power. So a tiny number of people make all of the decisions. And are we surprised? They took the surplus and they said, you know, there's another distribution of the surplus. We're rich and powerful. We better give a cut of the surplus to the political system. That's what we're going to do. We're going to give to the candidate and the party and the special political action committee and all the other apparatus. Why? Why? You need this explained to you? To make sure that the inconvenience of a democratic voting system, where everybody has one vote, not about how much money they have, but by the fact that they're a living person, that's a very dangerous arrangement. Tiny number of people make all the economic decisions. Massive people have political power. You got to neutralize that, or else you're going to be giving a constant invitation to the mass of people to use the power of universal suffrage to undo the effects of the economy. So what they've done is they've bought the political system. But please understand, what employs people? If they use a lot of the surplus to accumulate, to grow their businesses, that means using the surplus to hire more people. We have employment, we have a good employment situation, we have jobs for all of us, if and only if the tiny number of people who gather the surplus into their hands decide, for their own reasons, to take a large portion of it to grow the company. These days, corporations are making enormous surpluses because wages are low and productivity is high. But you know what? They're not accumulating capital with it at all. The little bit of growing the company that they do happens in another country. They move the money out of the United States and they grow the business in China or Brazil or someplace else. So in this country, nothing. Our politics is bought by the surplus. Our growth is stymied by how they use the surplus. The wealth of the shareholders goes crazy because they distribute a lot of it to them. All the social problems, all the economic problems we've talked about tonight have one common core: a system in which the mass of people gather in the enterprises we have, the corporations, to produce a surplus for a tiny group of people who use them in a way we all have to live with, but we have no power to influence or shape. We're excluded. So of course the logic, if that's your analysis, and this is Marx's analysis, this is what he does in Capital. If that's the analysis, the conclusion, in a sense, leaps out at you. The mass of people, the ones working there, to start with them, they've got to make the decision of what is done with the surplus they all produced. This is not a revolutionary demand, although it is in our culture. It's a logical outcome of the analysis, which is why Marxian economics can't be taught, of course. Because once you lay it out here, and I can tell from your faces, it's kind of straightforward. You can kind of see what ought to be done here. It's done, not rocket science. So you can't have this explained to the American people. Because, especially in a country where you babble endlessly about democracy, oh, everything is justified by democracy, that the first question a half-wit would ask is, excuse me, but Democracy would mean that the people as a whole would make these decisions. The mass of people who produce the surplus and the mass of people who live with the results of the surplus. That's us would have to have a way to decide what to do with the surplus we produce, since it shapes the lives we live. And that's the end of capitalism. No more small group of people, no more accumulation of shares, no more boards of directors elected by shareholders according to how many shares. That's over. That's the structural change that they didn't push through in the 1930s. They had the political power to have pushed it. Or at least it looks backward. When we look back, it looks like it. They didn't see it that way. They pushed for what Piketty wanted. High taxes on income, corporations, and high taxes on individuals. Again, for those of you that haven't been here before, top tax on the highest, top rate for the richest people in America on the personal income tax in the 1950s and 60s, 91%. In 1944, Roosevelt sent his State of the Union message to the Congress for 100% tax. Every dollar over $25,000 a year in 1944, President Roosevelt said the government should take all of it. He effectively said there's going to be not just a minimum wage, which Roosevelt had pushed through in the 1930s, but a maximum income. A minimum and a maximum. And the Congress went crazy when the bill came. And before the dust settled, the Republicans, yelling and screaming, made a compromise. 1944, the top rate of income tax in the United States, 94%. Today it's 39%. What do we see? We see rolling it all back. If we don't want that again, if we want the working class to be convinced that it's worth another enormous upheaval to produce and to staff a labor movement, a socialist movement, a communist, whatever the names are we give to it, then we have to offer them something that is more likely to give them the result they fought for last time and lost, that they can believe this time it's doable. Mr. Piketty, for all of that, is useless. What he's good for is to say, hey, the system, you leave it be, it's going to create a country that blows itself up by its extreme inequality. I mean, you should have gasped when I read to you that we have 3 times the level of women dying in childbirth that Great Britain does. What possible excuse? What possible? When I told you stories of wild dogs ravaging Detroit, you must have thought you were in a bad movie. What is going on is a massive hollowing out of the whole middle of the United States. We're leaving nothing to our, last month I told you about reverse mortgages. We're giving up our homes. We can't even pass our homes to our kids because we're pulling the money out of them. Today I tell you about 401ks. That's it. The pensions are not there. They're not going to take care of the old people, and there's nothing for their children. Nothing. It's over. You're dissolving in one generation what the previous 2 generations tried to build up. It's going on all around you, and really the only question is, can you formulate a sense of what is happening? Can you talk with your fellow citizens and begin to rebuild the old organizations, or if that's hopeless, build new ones? I wish I could tell you there is an organization, go join it. There is, I wish, I really wish. And if there is one that comes, I'll be the first, believe me, to sign up. But the crucial thing is not that this or that organization. The crucial thing is to realize we are in what chemists call a supersaturated solution. I don't know how many of you remember chemistry. It's when you have a lot of some particular matter that's been dissolved in the water so much that it only needs another dip, a little grain of something, and the whole thing becomes solid because it's kind of on the edge. The water can't hold anymore, and we're that way. This is a society that is blowing itself up. And just as we were amazed that a group of young people setting up tents in a little park in lower Manhattan would somehow reach the American people, and it did, we're going to be likely surprised by whatever the next grain dropped in the supersaturated solution does. But that's where we are. And the biggest question, and that we have to stop with tonight, the biggest question, will the left, which is sort of you, will the left be able to rise to this situation and come up with a plan, an understanding, a strategy that can move this society now that it's really possible, now that millions of Americans are looking around? That's the question. It is kind of the moment. And I can stand here and people like me can explain this from here to tomorrow, but it has to be internalized and operationalized into some kind of movement. Thank you very, very much for your I hope he was interested. Okay, we have 10 minutes or so. Can we, sir?
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. First of all, I think your criticism of Piketty is well received, and I agree with you. However, my father and his friends and all the baby boom parents of some of us that are in the 30s and under crowd, maybe even a little bit older, but I've been trying to talk to my father about this for years, and mentioning Marx until very recently received the horns on the head response, and people would take, especially the baby boom generation, take pride in being ignorant, and it's apparently big news to people that historical materialism is a factor in in understanding economics, and the kind of conflicts that we're seeing repeat themselves over and over again. I work in the medieval period, and this stuff has been going on for a very long time. So, but I have to say that I think we should thank Piketty for actually making this mainstream, and for the first time I've started to see a large number of people of the kind of 60-plus generation that weren't persuaded of the left at all start to realize, oh man, my grandchildren, their future is all fucked up. Things are not going to be going well, and man, Piketty has opened their eyes all of a sudden. Now it's almost like he's interested in reading Marx's Capital, as a philosopher. So now I've ordered it for him, and he's actually not said anything nasty about it. So I was saying, how do you see, first of all, a entryway for re-articulating a position using this extraordinary re-articulation of Keynesianism for re-articulating a broader understanding for those kind of people? And I'll just leave it at that.
Well, again, for some of you who've been coming to these monthly meetings, because we have some who come to a lot of them and some who come occasionally. I have been saying fairly often, before the Piketty book even emerged, that I wanted to tell you about my own experience, because I'm already experiencing what you're saying. I believe I told you, but I'll mention it again. In April, the first week of April, I was brought to St. Louis, where I spoke at a place called Webster University to hundreds and hundreds of students, brought there by the university to listen to me. That's strange, folks, to listen to me. That was the first week of April. The second week of April, I was flown to Omaha, Nebraska, where I gave a talk on a weekday evening at the home of the Omaha Symphony Orchestra. And I spoke to 900 people who had paid tickets to listen to what I say, and I say the kinds of things I say here. In the third week of April, I flew to Portland, Maine, where I spoke at the University of Southern Maine to another audience of hundreds. And in the fourth and final week of April, I went to Rhode Island, where I spoke in Providence and Kingston, at Brown University, at Rhode Island College, and at the University of Rhode Island. America is not the same place if someone like me, identified as a Marxian economist, is traveling all over the place, talking to all kinds of people in places that didn't normally, like you said of the folks you've been talking to, that wouldn't 3, 4, 5 years ago have dreamed of going to such an evening or listening to such a person or taking seriously what he said. and I'm having wonderful time. I'm enjoying it. I couldn't come here and do this if it wasn't an extraordinary experience for me. So I'm here to tell you, this is not what it was in the last 40 years. A whole generation of Americans are having, as you put it well, a sense that this is over, that some period of American history that you might have hoped to be part of, a rising society, is now on the down, and that it's bad for you and bad for young people everywhere. It's an extraordinary situation, but it creates an openness of the American people to what we have to say, and that's why I keep saying, up until a few years ago, we might have had some truth to say, well, it's very hard for us to get our point of view of it, and the media don't open to us, and blah, 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 blah. All that is still, part of that is true. But we have an opening like the likes of which I have never seen in my lifetime. So it's a large question. It's on us. We have an historic opportunity now. Are we going to be able and willing to search for and find the ways to talk about it, to analyze it, to mobilize with other people? That's the question. That's the question. Yeah.
How useful do you think it is to actually put a face on, say, the Fortune 1000 directors? I'm sure 1,000 companies, it's not 12,000 directors, it's probably less than that.
Much fewer. They overlap.
But, so, actually talking about a group of people who are truly the decision makers for the whole economy, who are not elected and who essentially are private power running the economy, and the global economy at that.
I think it's not a question of whether it's a good idea, it's a question of how it's done. The problem often is that the way these things are done is they're listed, their names, their faces are shown, and we get to meet them. And then the argument is made, they're awful, they're bad people, they're consumed with greed, that kind of argument. And that leads, for me, to a very dangerous place. If we get rid of them, throw them in jail, remove them from their positions, what we've done is we've personalized the issue and we miss the systemic. You get them all in jail, they'll be replaced by their underlings who will do the same thing because they've been doing it all their lives. The system of rewards and punishments that gets people to behave in a certain way will have been left in place, and then we have no one to blame but ourselves that the next group show up to be all not that big of a different from the ones that we vented our anger on. So I don't mind introducing them, but only if the point made by giving them names and faces is that the system has to be changed. So that perfectly nice people who are really wonderful with their children and are stunning with their family dog still on the end are forced to behave in a way that is unacceptable for the society as a whole.
And their jobs should be eliminated.
And their positions,
They
yeah.
should be laid off.
They should be put in the same position as all the other workers. They have no more, no less. If they work there, they contribute, they get their share, but they're not in this undemocratic, economic aristocracy that we basically allow. By the way, I find it extraordinarily effective to use the democratic lingo and the democratic imagery to make my points. As I drive home to people, as I do over and over again, when you cross the threshold into your job, you're giving up all that democratic babble you do all the time. You're letting a tiny handful of people that you don't elect, you don't even know who they are, make the decision whether your job disappears next week, whether your pension is reduced by half, whether you have to work with a toxic technology, all of that, you accept it. Like some medieval caricature of a peasant who bows down to the king without asking, why am I doing this? When you finish with that, and I can finish with a kind of a gusto that says, okay, the corporation, the business location, the workplace is the most undemocratic structure we allow in this society. Where we spend most of our time as adults is at work, 5 out of 7 days, all the best hours of the day. If anywhere democracy, if we believe in it, should have been institutionalized, it's at work. Instead, we live in a society that is exempted where we spend most of our time. What kind of fakery? The audience just sits there and stares at me because no one has ever done this before, but they have that recognition, what are they going to say? What's wrong with this? There isn't anything. There just isn't. Yeah.
I would say you missed both prison and school as the most undemocratic institution.
Okay, well, you got the contest. Yes. Well, prisons, at the Left Forum, we're going to have, because of Angela Davis, and she does a lot of work on that subject, that we're going to have a number of panels devoted to the whole issue of prisons. But I'd like to remind people to read the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. It won't take you long. It has exactly 2 sentences. It outlaws slavery in the United States, except in prisons. This is an amazing document. It is acceptable, it's a part of the United States Constitution, to enslave a prisoner. Because you have been convicted of a crime, you are now, you can be a slave. It's extraordinary, what we do in terms of our commitment to democracy. What a wonderful way to help reintroduce a criminal into the normal life of our society by subjecting him or her, well, since the overwhelming majority of people in jail are males, by giving him a nice dose of slavery in which he's on the wrong end of this institution. But what a wonderful way then to shovel him back in to the rest of society. You got to be nuts. You're surprised that we have high recidivism, on and on and on. Schools, yes, but of course I can't discuss schools since there I am a guard. No, let me get some people who haven't said something. Yeah.
You always do a great job at selling us, but I kept thinking, part of what I was thinking about was, I heard Trumka, he doesn't do as good a job as you do, but the punchline of his story of what's wrong is, you people have to do something. I heard Angela Davis and Harry Belafonte in the last 2 years tell the same story and say, you people have to do something. And yet I sit in rooms like this and say, okay, Mr. Trumka, you have a staff, you have a meeting place, you have money. How come you don't call a meeting for us people to come to? Where are we supposed to find the money to hire an auditorium to do it? And then, so that's a piece of where I'm not terribly happy. A couple of nights ago, I heard Les Leopold, who's got half a dozen, some funny critique book critiquing all of this, talk about something that makes such good sense about the populist moment. That time when something really actually almost happened in the United States, when we, the people, and of course, and I'm a third party, Green Party person, unfortunately, the Populist Party went the fusion route with the Democrats, and that was the end of that. No effect. But Leopold's point is to create what they did to create that populist moment. He would like to see us get 6,000 lecturers to go out and talk to people, to bring them together. So I think it's worth talking about.
She had 2 points. One was that we need 6,000 lecturers to go around the country and make the argument.
It's working off the populist.
The old Populist Party before it was absorbed by the Democrats. And the other one, which I think I'd like to respond to, was a bit of a critique on some of the leaderships of those organizations that still exist, like the trade unions, for always saying to somebody else, do it, why don't you do it? And I think that's a very, very important insight. Even though I work with trade unions and I'm not an enemy of them, the trade unions nonetheless, like other organizations, protect themselves in their own cocoons by saying, with justice, that it's hard for them to do something as leaders unless there's a mass movement behind them and pushing them. And I think there's a point there. They have a point, I give them that. But then if that's what they really believe, then they ought to be using their positions to build the very movement underneath that they can then respond to. That they don't do very well, and they don't do it very much. I'm a little reminded also of our president, Mr. Obama, who said to no small number of people that if the Occupy Wall Street movement was stronger and was more sustained and was more of a political presence in America, well, then it would be easier for him to do the kind of things they wanted. Okay, I gave him, there's a point. I understand what the man is saying. He needs the political support. But that's the same president who then at the same weekend coordinated 50 cities across the United States which bulldozed those Occupy Wall Street people out of their tents. Well, you can't have it both ways. If you want the mass movement that'll allow you to act, then you got to use your position to help that movement develop. Otherwise, you're destroying what you claim to want to see be there to enable you to function, and I'm not sure that that's a reasonable position, sir.
I want to go back to her question about the lecturers.
Okay.
My question was going to be, are there colleagues of yours, are there other Marxist economists who are also in demand and speaking around the country? How could there be such a speakers bureau or a network of educators or lecturers or something, more people doing the same thing you're doing? Because obviously, as you say, the person is there for the ideas.
You know, I think that the simple answer is there are loads of people. There are loads of people who are economists and professors of this and that, and activists across in the churches, in the schools, all over the place. They are a little shy of coming forward. I mean, we are coming out of a 50-year cocoon in which having these kinds of ideas and being public about them got you into a lot of difficulty. So it's going to take us some time before a shell-shocked community of these sorts of people feel it's okay. And sometimes what I say to myself is, either because of some wonderful character qualities that I possess, or that I'm nuts, I'm out there a little earlier than other people, and that part of my job is to show everybody, you can do this. You can do this. And I try to say, and I mean it, I really mean what I'm about to say. I am having the time of my life. I love this. You can tell, can't you? I put on a show here. But I enjoy this. I'm like a comedian who thinks his own jokes are fantastic, you know? Because I've had these ideas most of my life, but I've always been on the edges. People look at me kind of funny. Maybe it's a little scary to even hear this kind of idea. And now, people love it. They come in large numbers. They applaud. I was saying to my friend Aubrey over here the other day, I understand that part of what's happening is I go in and I explain stuff, and that's useful. I'm a teacher. It's what I've done all my life. But more and more, a third to a half of what happens in my talks isn't a lecture. It is a pep rally. It is an experience, and I realize I'm like, you know, cheering that our football team is going to do real well tomorrow, and we're all, you know, I don't get excited about this. But at first I was a little bit depressed. This is not, people are not thinking, but I've changed my mind. This is fantastic. This is because people, they're already 3/4 there. I give them a little more, but they're already, what they want is not another explanation. It's useful, nice. What they want is that feeling of being part of a collective movement that by its very numbers and its enthusiasm gives them the sense, I can do something. There's enough of us. We're strong. We're feeling our oats. Good. That's the next step. That means that the effort to teach is already on its own beginning to morph into the enthusiasm that makes a social movement. I mean, I go back sometimes and look at the old films of the 1930s. You know, New York was a center for things that happened in the 1930s. Union Square, which is a few blocks from here, was a place where there were demonstrations every night for months on end of unemployed people and homeless people and union members and socialists and communists. They all had demonstrations and speakers and singers, and it was like a continuing festival. And in that process, I remember my first question is, well, on other nights were there, and the historian who was showing this to me said, it was only leftists. Nobody else ever did it. The leftists had taken over the public space. And a person, you know, going for a walk at night would meander over to the Union Square Park and be regaled by a lecture or a folk singer or this or that, and kind of get caught up in the feeling of this. You know, it has reverberations, it has echoes in revivals, in religious revival movement, and so on. When people begin to have a sense that movement and change are possible. You know, sometimes you think of it as a personal, I am going to be saved. But it isn't such a long step before we are going to be saved and we are going to get a change. Yes, sir?
Just a comment to the last question. You want to mention Herpes Economy Connection, Speakers Bureau?
Sure, well, why don't you?
Well, it's a union of radical political economists run a speakers bureau called Economy Connection, and they send out people who to talk about the radical economists to make talks similar to what we're doing.
Absolutely. And IRPI's been around for, 40 years. And they maintain this economy connection, and the young woman here in the New York area who runs it. And yes, they provide speakers, and with a little effort you will find them. There are now new speakers bureaus beginning to pop up. Shane Smith and I are thinking about moving in the direction of setting up, in the framework of the kind of things that we're doing, finding the people who are comfortable in this framework and offering them as speakers bureaus and so forth. Yeah, but all of this is happening more quickly here than there. It's all happening in a way that it hasn't for a long time, which is why I am feeling, positive the way I do. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to mention something that's not so positive about Union Square. For those of you who don't know, Bloomberg gave a permission of some kind, and now Bill de Blasio, who opposed it, he was the city plus, now he's going along with it, that they built in that pavilion. And I've been watching it. I've been watching these guys work, and I say, oh, we're fixing this playground. They ain't fixing a playground. They have a restaurant that they
Going in
own.
there, huge, expensive restaurant, where that children's playground area
Yes.
is, at the
And
northern end of the park.
Blasio says he's gonna let them have it for a year. Anyway, I don't know what we can do, but just so more and more of us know about it, it really, it's really.
I just want to let some folks who haven't said, over here.
Just, like to just share something to piggyback on the on the breadth of the appeal. I know someone who actually spoke to a gathering of Black Christian ministers who tend to be pretty conservative, and not particularly progressive in economic terms, or informed, of course, and talked about the kind of things that Rick's talked about tonight. Used the same language, economic democracy, going down the line, and I saw this with my own eyes. These guys, they're bishop this, bishop that. You can see them in the news and all that. They actually went crazy. They loved it. Some were crying, like I had no idea, and they were just so thankful to hear that kind of thing. Now, if that can happen in a setting like that, it can really happen. I mean, that's like one of the hardest places for that to happen. It really shows that it's time, and that it can go on anywhere. And it's our time to really spread the word and to fight against the system of that.
Yeah, ma'am?
Are you concerned that the militarization of the police and the abnegation of posse comitatus and the shredding of the Constitution are such huge obstacles that when they can crush the Occupy movement as they did, and now they want to take the guns away, and of course the right wing has the most guns anyway, and now Bloomberg wants to spend money to take our guns so that they don't come after him, I suppose. I don't have a gun. But what gives you hope with all of that?
Well, because I see.
Oh, and I left one thing out, the drugging of Americans. So many are on Prozac. They're sympathetic, and now they legalize marijuana, which may make the situation even worse.
Or better.
Or better. Well, I think, but it's a serious question. But I guess and there's really no other way to say it, my positivity or my optimism, if you like, kind of carries me in this area. I see these as signs of very serious weakness. A society that is confident of its cohesion, of its sense of community, of a certain solidarity. A society that believes that the sentence, we're all Americans, actually means something to people, wouldn't need to do this. What are you doing? Why do you have the Patriot Act? Why do you have all those camps for people that are not foreigners, they're Americans, and that's clear if you have half a brain. This is a society that has enough in it that people half consciously and half unconsciously are preparing for the very breakdown they deny is being fomented by this system. I think that's a fundamental weakness. Will it be used against the left? Sure. It would be naive not to anticipate that stuff. But I did say, I think last week, and I tell a story that I love to tell, it's an apocryphal story, that after the revolution in Moscow and Leningrad in 1917, a few weeks later, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin are sitting at the table, and in comes one of their assistants who's bringing the books of the secret police. And so this is the day they open the books and they find out who was spying on their Bolshevik party. And they go leaf through, and the three men get more and more depressed. And until Lenin has some kind of moment, and he starts smiling. So he's feeling better, but Trotsky and Stalin are very upset. Why? Because it turns out that half the people in the Bolshevik party were informing for the police, and that everything they did, which is not far from what the story was. And then Lenin says, but you know, that's a good sign, because when history is on your side, he says, when the movement of the social system is in a certain direction, it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't. Even when they have all of that, they can't prevail. A million little decisions by a million people in a million little moments give you the victory despite all of the apparatus of the secret police and so forth. And indeed, when you see any of the old empires or the new ones fall, they all fall despite having unspeakably complicated. You go to Eastern Germany, and people will tell you about the Stasi, about the secret police establishment in that country, which was extraordinary. Didn't help them. You know, Gorbachev and the people before him, they had an unbelievable secret police apparatus. Didn't help them. We have an unbelievable secret apparatus in ... Not going to help us either. Maybe very painful. I don't want to minimize the danger. You're right. But I don't think that those things decide historical moments. We may not be at a historical moment yet, but we're getting closer, and at that point, they're not going to have enough people. They're not going to be able to trust them. They trusted Mr. Snowden. Didn't work out real well. Sir?
A comment and a question. Your last entry, political system. Economics is the study of how money is distributed. Politics is to whom? As everyone here knows, Google is an American corporation. As many people here know, their profits show up in Ireland. If, God forbid, the transatlantic free trade agreement goes through, can the United States tax Google?
The United States can tax Google whenever the United States wants to. This is a purely political question. Whatever the law now says, that law can be changed. Whatever the law gives them the right to do, the law can be amended or repealed. This is never a question of some economic principle or some arcane structural imperative. It isn't that. It's a political decision. Just like everything else that goes on in this society. It's a political decision. We outlawed slavery. We said at a certain point in this country's history, it was a political decision that slavery is unacceptable. One person cannot own and deal with as property another person. Well, there it is.
And wiped out
Now,
most of the capital in the process.
Well, what I was going to say would go in the same place is, why couldn't we have a constitutional amendment that says one person cannot exploit another? In other words, we cannot have a relationship in which one person produces a surplus that another person who didn't help produce it gets. Not going to happen. That is a fundamentally unacceptable arrangement. If you are a producer of a surplus, you by rights must be a participant in receiving and deciding the distribution of that surplus. And to have a person in a position who decides how to distribute a surplus that he or she did not participate in producing is as odious and impossible for our value system as we once decided slavery was. Then it's over. What you've effectively done is passed a constitutional amendment that renders capitalism abolished. You know, maybe this will help. In the movement against slavery in the United States, for years, there were two kinds of movements, if you like, two kinds of mentalities. One kind of mentality said, look at the slaves. The slaves are not fed properly. The slaves are not clothed properly. The slaves are required to be ripped apart in their families so that one member, the wife goes over here and the husband over there and the children over there. This is a terrible time. We must feed properly. We must clothe properly. And then there was a second group which turned to the first group and said, are you crazy? The problem isn't that the slave doesn't have enough clothes. The problem is that he's a slave. The job is not to improve the conditions of the slave. Does that mean those people were not in favor of improving the conditions? Of course they were in favor. But this is not what they were fighting for. They were fighting to end slavery. My reaction is, bravo. Now make the same logic apply to capitalism. Is the job of the left to get workers a higher wage? And look, am I against the $15 an hour minimum wage? Of course not. But there are people who are fighting for that. What we need in this country are people who say, like with slavery, wait a minute. The job is not to give the worker, the one who produces the surplus, a better wage. But stop being excluded from deciding what happens with the surplus your labor produces. Why do you permit this? It's like permitting yourself to be somebody else's slave. We ended slavery. We took a class structure, an economic system premised on ownership of persons, and we said as a nation, no more. Done. Except in jails. Well, what's to prevent us from outlawing this? Yeah.
Well, then I just wonder, what do you think? I mean, I agree with you, but if the object is to change the structure, then do you think something like the $15 minimum wage is a good step to get there, or that should be skipped?
It's never a question, do we do it or not? It's a question of how do you do this? If you make the $15 the beginning and the end of what you're doing, then I would be opposed to it. This is not what I'm there for. I feel a camaraderie with those who want that. You want to give, I mean, who in this room is going to object to saying that a person who works at Starbucks or at McDonald's should get 50, I mean, instead of 750 or whatever the hell it is? Of course. But that's not what animates me. Just like I feel that was not what animated those that I felt closest to in the anti-slavery movement. I don't want people exploited. Marx's definition of exploitation is when the people who produce the surplus are not included in deciding what is done with the surplus their labor helped to produce. For me, that's exploitation. That's unacceptable as a way to organize human society. It is, and I said that, and I get that from Marx, and that's all long before Mr. Piketty. That's a critique that is independent of whether people are becoming relatively more or less unequal in the distribution. It goes beyond that, even though you can take a position on the inequality question. Who hasn't? Well, no, let me let one other person, because he hasn't had a chance. Peter.
There's also a strain in Marxism that speaks when the crisis comes of there having to be a decision between barbarism and communism. Yeah. And one can see the movement in the direction of barbarism growing in the U.S. also.
Yes.
I wonder if you have experience
experience dealing with the Tea Party, or how your message, which to some extent overlaps with Tea Party concerns also, whether it has a chance of dealing with that?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and let me conclude tonight by I'll tell you the answer, and then I want your advice, all of you. I have, on occasion, been invited by Tea Party groups, or at least that's how they identified themselves, to come and speak with them. And I've had a little bit of email back and forth, not recently, but about a year and a half ago. And I didn't know what to do. Part of me was intrigued because of just what you said. Gee, there is some, and when I asked, it was my critique of the inequality and of the top down. They liked that. They liked that. But they had gone to my website, which if you go to my website, rdwolff.com, you will see Marx and Marxism all through there, and it was a mystery to me how they missed that. Because, well, when I asked them, you know, anything in my website kind of worry you? No. Quickly answered, no. So I couldn't understand it. And I started to go in the direction, maybe I ought to do that. Maybe I ought to, it's an audience I don't normally reach, okay? If I'm going to go to Omaha, Nebraska and talk to people in Nebraska, a state I had never been to before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, a state that is very conservative these days, very, what do you call it, red state and all that, they corrected me. I made a couple of jokes to try to open the evening up in a relaxed way, and they got a little bit irritated with me, and they explained to me with great pride that yes, they are Republican. Many in the audience were Republicans and told me that and were proud of it. But they were also the kind of Republicans who then gave me a lesson. We are the only state, they said, with real pride, that has no private electrical company allowed in our state. All power is public. All cities and towns in Nebraska have a public source of power, and they launched into these lectures, several people. They were excited and they were talking over each other, but the message was clear. And this was them, these Republicans. It's wonderful. Because these companies don't have to make profit, you see, they explained to me, they can deliver electricity to us cheaper than if they had why should we have, here it comes Nebraska, why should we have rich investors in New York and Chicago owning the electric companies, and so we have to pay more to make fat profits for these people? These are Republicans. These are proud to tell me that, which by the way, I checked this is true, Nebraska is the only state that forbids private electric power. It's a 100% public power situation. I can tell from your faces, you didn't know either. So I think in a sense it's an analog. It's like the Tea Party. There's something for us to talk about now, something important. But then to tell you the other side of it, as we discussed a couple times, when I got a little bit further and I made a phone call, they began to talk to me. It became clear that if I went to the Tea Party, there would be people talking about African Americans, Hispanics, and immigrants in a way that I'm not sure how I could handle answering. That is, there's a level of racism and a level of anti-immigration feeling that is scary. It's just scary. I'm not used to that. I don't know quite how I would handle that. I don't know how they would handle how I would handle that. So here's my request for advice. I didn't go. Bottom line is I didn't go. I'm still not sure that was the right decision. I think there would be more invitations, but I don't know how to navigate that circumstance. And my problem is all of our problem, because I think it is right that the Tea Party is not a homogeneous entity. There's all kinds of movements there, and all kinds of directions, just like on the left, and that there are all kinds of people that we might have a lot in common to talk about and to work with, and it would be a shame and maybe dangerous for us not to be trying to see what there is there. But you would need to have a stronger stomach than I have, and you'd need to have some training about how to, which I don't have, about how to navigate that situation, or else it could disintegrate and we would start, punching each other or something like that, and, that I'm not sure that's gonna be a very successful, sir.
So you were talking before about how basically, well, I'm just gonna cut it short. I've been for a long time. Salvador Zizek wrote in a book called First Dish Tragedy and Its Farce. He wrote something along the lines of like, in capitalism, charity is actually unethical because it basically keeps us illusion that the system is something that's workable and sane, and giving up the breadcrumbs, so to speak, is actually more harmful than, like, if we did that to slaves, like you were talking about before, if we gave them clothes and food and so on and make their conditions better, but continued in slavery.
Right.
Do you think that's unethical? Do you think charity is unethical? No, it's Ayn Rand, right?
It's for me, again, the question of how you manage this. I hate charity because it seems to me always a way of making mostly yourself pure, better. It's your way of dealing. You know the situation is awful. You know that it shouldn't be that you're there all dressed to the nines and you've just come out of the fancy restaurant and you're now going to give 2 quarters to a person sitting on the street. You know there's something wrong in this picture. But instead of thinking it through or doing something about it in a social way, you give a sum of money that is meaningless to you to this person. And you go down the street feeling better, and typically the giver feels better about all of this than the recipient of the transaction. But you have elided, you have avoided, you have skirted around the social issue that is staring you in the face. And you've tried to use a personal or individual act or decision to cope with a social problem. I think there's a fundamental rule in politics. You don't solve social problems with individual actions. A social problem needs a social solution, a social movement. An individual can help build that, and that's wonderful. But if you imagine that you can solve a social problem with an individual act, you're making a terrible mistake that is going to leave the social problem unsolved and you very frustrated. Folks, you've stayed a long time, longer than we normally do, and there are some folks here who have to get home because they work here. Thank you very, very much, and I hope to see you next month.